Hello, in this video I'm going to give a brief introduction to special senses and then talk about our two special senses that are chemical sensitive, which are gustation and olfaction. So the special senses include vision, hearing, olfaction, which is smell, gustation, which is taste, and balance. A lot of people think that touch is one of the special senses, but it is not. It's considered a general sense. And one way to remember this is the fact that special senses are restricted to the head only, right? So if you think about vision, hearing, taste, smell, and balance, all of those things are detected by some sort of complicated organ in the head. So our special senses require cells in order to detect a stimulus, right? So with the special senses, we're going to be detecting different kinds of stimuli. Chemicals when it comes to taste and smell, and it's going to be light when it comes to vision, and it's going to be some sort of movement when it comes to hearing and balance. So these special cells have to be able to respond to the stimulus, right? And in response to the stimulus, these cells have to be able to release neurotransmitter. And when they release the neurotransmitter, they will be starting the relay of a signal towards the brain. And the process of a special sense cell taking some sort of stimulus and turning that into a signal in the body, that process is called transduction. Now, many of the cells that are involved with special senses have specialized extensions for detecting the stimuli. So they have these little hairs, if you will, or cilia or stereocilia that extend off their cell membrane. And these hairs or stereocilia are going to be used in detecting the stimulus. This is true for most, but not all of our special senses. Because these cells have hair-like projections on them, we often refer to these cells as hair cells. Hearing, balance, and gustation all employ some type of hair cell or something very similar. Olfaction does use something that looks a lot like a hair cell, but it's more akin to a typical neuron with little extensions coming off of it. Vision does not use hair cells at all. So let's take a look at the overall process of how a special sense cell can send a signal to the brain. Okay? So first of all, the cell has to be activated by some sort of stimulus. In the case of gustation and olfaction, it will be a chemical. In the case of hearing and balance, it'll be movement or mechanics. Right? In the case of vision, it will be light. The cell will then experience something called a receptor potential. So a receptor potential is just a type of graded potential, right? And this graded potential will often either lead to an action potential or to the direct release of neurotransmitter. And in the case of it leading to an action potential, the action potential, of course, is going to cause the release of neurotransmitter. So in either case, you're getting the release of neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter is then picked up by another cell in the pathway. So there's another neuron that is very close to the special sense cell. And the neurotransmitter is released into the synaptic cleft between the special sense cell and this other neuron. And this other neuron then picks up the neurotransmitter, and then this neuron itself will experience a graded and action potential. And now what we've done is we've started transferring the signal towards the brain. Right? So the action potential will travel along the axon of that neuron, which runs through a cranial nerve towards the brain. The action potential will cause the release of neurotransmitter, usually at another neuron at the thalamus, because the thalamus is the area of the brain where we filter incoming sensory information. And then another neuron will then send the signal towards the cerebral cortex, right? So the signals usually go to a primary sensory cortex of the brain, and that's where we become aware of the sensation. And then the information is spread to association areas in the cerebral cortex where we make cognitive sense of what it is that we're sensing. In other words, perception occurs. So the first special sense we're going to take a look at is gustation. Right? So gustation takes place mostly on the tongue. Right? And you're probably aware that your tongue has little bumps on them. Maybe you've had one swollen before. You might have called it a swollen taste bud. But those aren't taste buds. Those are actually little structures called papillae. And the papillae are like little mountains all over your tongue. And the taste buds are actually found on the sides of those mountains. So let's take a closer look at the cells within the taste bud. Right? So a taste bud contains multiple gustatory cells. So the gustatory cell is the special sense cell that will detect the chemicals in the food that you eat. So the gustatory cells are a type of chemoreceptor hair cell, and they're activated by chemicals that are dissolved in your saliva. The chemicals bind to chemically gated ion channels on the gustatory cell, and that will cause a receptor potential in the gustatory cell. The gustatory cell will then release neurotransmitter, and that neurotransmitter is picked up by a sensory neuron. And eventually, the information will be sent to the brain and will reach your cerebral cortex, where you can taste delicious chocolate cake. Let's take a closer look at the picture at the bottom of the screen here. Okay, so this is a general description for what happens in a special sense cell. And it's not exactly true for all special sense cells, but it is very similar in the different types of special sense cells. So number one is telling us that a stimulus is arriving. This can be movement in the case of hearing, or a chemical in the case of taste. Right? And the stimulus arriving opens a gated ion channel. Ions enter into the special sense cell, leading to a receptor potential. The receptor potential then causes the release of neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter is then picked up by another neuron in the pathway, and now that neuron will then experience an action potential, and now the signal is being sent towards the central nervous system. So we see this pattern with all of our special senses. So maybe you've heard that there is a map to the different types of taste on our tongue. But actually scientists have discovered that that isn't true. There isn't one particular taste map that fits all people. Instead, it's different for different people. We do know our primary taste flavors, right? The primary taste flavors are sweet, salt, bitter, sour, and something called umami. Umami is sort of like a brothy kind of flavor. It's associated with things like MSG and like soups and things like that. Apparently we must have a taste flavor for pig, according to this little baby, right? I like bacon. All right, now let's take a look at olfaction, our sense of smell. So olfaction uses a type of cell called an olfactory receptor. And these are more akin to a typical neuron than our other special sense cells are. So these are neurons that can detect chemicals that are in the air in your nasal passages. Okay. The cell bodies of these neurons and the dendrites of these neurons are basically dangling in your nasal cavity. I say dangling, but really they're embedded in epithelial tissue. Okay. And they have little hair-like projections coming off of them, and those hair-like projections are embedded in the mucus of that epithelial tissue. So the chemicals that penetrate into the mucus layer can bind to those little hair-like projections, and that's going to lead to your sense of smell. The axons of these neurons, though, the axons are running through the tiny holes in the cribriform plate called the olfactory foramina. Right? And the axons go up through the olfactory foramina to the olfactory bulb, where they will form a synapse with another neuron in the pathway. So how does the process of olfaction occur, right? Well, this picture should look familiar, right? The hairs, or the little dendrites of the olfactory receptors, like I said, they're lying embedded in the mucus of your nasal passage. Chemicals that are in the air that you breathe will dissolve in the mucus and then bind to chemically gated ion channels that cause a receptor potential and then an action potential in the olfactory neuron. The olfactory neuron then releases neurotransmitter, which is picked up by another neuron in the pathway. And that, don't forget, the synapse between the olfactory neuron and this other neuron in the pathway occurs in the olfactory bulb, which is actually a cranial nerve. And then eventually the information will reach your cerebral cortex, where you smell, in this case, apparently delicious chocolate. Okay. Apparently I like chocolate. We bypass the thalamus with olfaction. So there is no filtering at the thalamus with your sense of smell. Instead, we have a direct connect basically between the olfactory bulb and the areas of the cerebral cortex that are responsible for perception of smell. Now, interestingly, most of what we think of as flavor is actually smell. So when we're tasting food, what we think of as just pure taste really isn't pure taste. It's a combination of taste and smell, and they think most of it is actually smell. Okay? This is because both taste and smell are integrated together in the cerebral cortex, right? So your olfactory and gustatory stimuli are integrated at the cerebral cortex together, and they're combined to produce what you think of as flavor. So there's a job out there called a professional taster. So these people work for food companies, and their job is obviously to taste the food, but they'll do things like cover up their other senses while they're tasting the food. They'll plug their nose so they can't smell, they'll wear a blindfold so they can't see, so that their brain isn't interpreting all these different pieces of information, so that they can try to get more of just what the pure taste is.